Shanker, Singham, will you explain to us a little bit more about the enterprise cities and what makes them different from other economic development initiatives?
Sure, thanks Danielle. The concept of the enterprise city that is different from ordinary economic development initiatives is that in addition to having a place, a city, that would be developed and service the need for moving people into urban areas, the city would be characterized by regulatory autonomy. Essentially what you have in many countries around the world, particularly developing countries and emerging markets, is you have the will that people have to grow their businesses, to be successful. You have the desire, but you have this desire running up against the barrier of the regulatory system, the governance system, that essentially destroys wealth out of the economy by distorting the market. So the purpose of an enterprise city is to create a regulatory environment that is pro-competitive, that minimizes what we call anti-competitive market distortions. Well, we're essentially allowing the entrepreneurial spirit in people to be successful, and we're creating a ladder so that the ladder along which an entrepreneur who takes risks can actually see his reward, his or her reward. We're creating a regulatory system that minimizes the anti-competitive market distortions in a country so that we can create wealth as opposed to destroying wealth. In many developing countries and emerging markets, it's the governance system and the regulatory system that prevents economic growth. And so what the contention that we have and the idea we have with enterprise cities is to allow that growth to occur by getting the regulatory system aligned with the economic incentives of the entrepreneurial class.
So there is capital available all over the world. What will make investors and all that capital be drawn to these special enterprise cities?
Right. I think what we have in the world is we have a lot of countries with distorted regulatory systems and distorted governance systems, and systems that frankly don't work very well for their people. And by creating a zone inside a country that actually has a pro-competitive system, these enterprise cities will act as magnets for the global supply chain, for elements of the global supply chain. So the enterprise city will essentially reduce the cost of certain elements of the supply chain, and it will attract investment and capital from all over the world, which is currently looking for somewhere to go. The capital is, as is often said, capital is a coward and flows where it is welcome and flows away from where it is unwelcome. Well, there are many countries around the world where capital is not welcome, and consequently they don't see that type of investment. By creating an enterprise city where the rules of the road are such that capital is welcomed, we will spur that kind of investment into the cities. There's a huge amount of capital that is on the sidelines, that is waiting for this kind of environment. And there's a huge pent-up demand from the investment community and from the capital community for the type of environment where they can place their investment and actually see real economic growth. The irony is that in the countries that most need capital and investment, you often find the rules and regulations and governance systems that are least welcoming of capital.
Right, to block that. And there's some examples where areas like that have grown. You mentioned Dubai. Give us a little bit more of an idea of those examples.
There are many examples of cities around the world. You know, one thinks of Hong Kong, Dubai, Singapore, other places where emphasis on a freer regulatory system, a more pro-competitive system, where you have a system of regulation or laws that encourages competition on the merits. When you have that as the organizing economic principle, then you start to see wealth creation and all kinds of economic growth, and you start to lift people out of poverty. Dubai was essentially a city planted in the desert, where there was nothing there. It's now a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Why is it a multi-billion-dollar enterprise? because the regulatory system in Dubai is significantly better, significantly more pro-competitive than the areas surrounding it. Hong Kong has been a huge engine and motor for growth of the Chinese economy since the handover in 1997. Why? Because the Chinese recognized that they had to convince the investment community that they wouldn't interfere with Hong Kong. And they did that through the promulgation of the Hong Kong Basic Law. And the Basic Law was the regulatory environment in Hong Kong and the system in Hong Kong that allowed people essentially to be economically free, to be free to pursue their own hopes and dreams without government interference.
And when you say merit, based on merit, that these companies can compete based on merit, tell us a little bit more about what does that actually mean?
Well, competition on the merits means that the results of the competition are going to be based on two things only: the quality of your ideas and how hard you're prepared to work to see them realized. Competition on the merits means that you're going to get better products at cheaper prices for consumers. And you're going to get more innovation, because innovation comes from the desire of companies and people to gain market share in an ordinary competition. Competition on the merits gets skewed when the regulatory system starts to favor particular local champions or domestic companies or some group of players, where it becomes more about who you know than what you know. And it's more about what are your relationships with the government, can you use those to get a result, as opposed to actually just simply competing on the business merits.
So when we have excessive amount of regulations, unnecessary regulations, in a way, doesn't that encourage corruption in the local economy rather than having a freer market? Do you think in and of itself, by not having so many regulations, you're actually fighting corruption?
Well, I think, first of all, I'd like to say that the system that we're envisaging is not necessarily a system of just fewer regulations for the sake of fewer regulations. What we're attempting to do is to create a regulatory environment that is pro-competitive, that minimizes the number of distortions, and so gets us back to the most optimal, welfare-enhancing market equilibrium, so that we're creating wealth at the most optimal rate.
Imagine a river, where you have a central stream in the river where the river is flowing the fastest. In an economy, that central stream of the river is where the economy is on the welfare-enhancing market equilibrium point. It's the fastest point in the river. If you place your boat in that central stream, you will go faster. As you come out of the central stream, you start to slow down. And that's what economies do when they start to distort the market. When you have regulation that starts to distort the market, it starts to move the boat out of the central stream of the economy and slows it down, and you get less economic development. So the first point would be that we want a regulatory system that maximizes economic freedom and optimizes wealth creation. Now, within that context, if you have an economy that is overly regulated, that is taking your boat out of the central stream, each excessive regulation is a choke point for corruption. It's an opportunity for somebody to say to a government official, let me pay you something so that I can overcome this particular regulatory barrier, as opposed to let me compete on the merits. Let me win in a competition on the merits. So by minimizing the regulatory burden over and above what is pro-competitive regulation, we are essentially fighting corruption, because corruption is ultimately inefficient, and a system of competition on the merits is what will actually reduce the burden of corruption that hangs over economies. You can imagine a very competitive race with 5 or 6 runners, all very close together. Anything that burdens them in any way will cause them to lose the race. So if I put a 5-pound weight on the arm of one of those runners, they will lose the race, because the race is so competitive. On the other hand, in a very highly regulated economy, or an economy with a lot of distortions, where you have one single favoured company that is far ahead of everyone else, I can burden that company with a lot. I can put a lot of corruption into the system, and it doesn't affect the result. So a competitive economy will cause corruption to decline across the board, because the people who are competing, the actual firms in the economy, will avoid corrupt activity, because corrupt activity will cause them to lose market share.
So Babson College is really well known for entrepreneurship. It is the top entrepreneurship college in the United States. Tell us, why is Babson College so supportive of this idea of enterprise cities?
Well, I'm delighted to be able to host the Competitiveness and Enterprise Development Project at Babson Global, which is the commercial arm of Babson College. And as you say, it is a well-known college around America and also the world for entrepreneurship. I think they are excited about this because Babson has a very international student base, and a lot of these international students go back to their countries and try to put in these entrepreneurship practices and theories and so on of the college, and find themselves thwarted by the regulatory environments and the governance environments in their countries. And so in order for people to benefit from entrepreneurship, which is the greatest force for humanity in terms of lifting people out of poverty, I think the college is realizing that you have to work not only in the pure business space, but you have to also work in the interaction between business and government space, and you have to work in the government space. And you have to ensure that governments are allowing people to be entrepreneurial and to be successful. Thomas Babson himself, the founder of the college, was a great believer in the forces of nature. He was a great student of Isaac Newton. He loved Isaac Newton. In fact, there's a row of Isaac Newton's apple trees in the college itself. And Newton had 3 laws of motion. And in this area, you really have 3 laws, fundamental laws. The first law is that wealth can be created or destroyed. And many countries that distort their markets are destroying wealth, and they're destroying the entrepreneurial spirit. When you destroy wealth, you also destroy hope. The second law is that wealth is much easier to destroy than it is to create. So governments that tend to set about trying to do things to benefit their entrepreneurs and their companies will often do things that end up destroying wealth rather than creating it. And the third law is that competition is the greatest force we know that liberates those wealth-creating forces. And these are forces of nature. They can't be bent, they can't be shaped by people who want them to operate a certain way. They always operate in a given direction. And our role in the Enterprise City program, and the role that I think Babson finds interesting, is that we can be a tool for allowing the systems in the country, the government systems, the governance systems, to operate in such a way that those creative forces of wealth creation and prosperity creation are allowed to work in the most optimal way. And then, when you've created that field, let people run as fast as they can. And that's when the entrepreneurial act will translate into the lifting of millions, if not billions, of people around the world out of poverty.
And the select governments that do implement these enterprise cities, in a way, get also promoted by Babson College as in terms of getting support for their efforts and validation for what they're trying to do and achieve. So I think that governments certainly have something to gain by that as well.
Well, certainly association with this is something that I think the investment community and the capital community is looking at.
So simply doing one of these projects is a very entrepreneurial thing to do. Governments that actually embrace this are being entrepreneurial in their governance approach and their approach to government in general. So I think governments that associate themselves with these projects are benefiting their people, they're benefiting themselves, and they're also acting like a demonstration model and a beacon to the rest of the world of what can be achieved when you actually allow economic freedom to prevail.
Thank you, Shanker Singham. We look forward to hearing more about these enterprise cities and which governments will be implementing them.
Well, thank you.